Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to this morning's moderator, Dr. Serkan Yolaçan, to kick off proceedings. Dr. Yolaçan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Welcome back for the first panel of the conference. We'll be tackling with the question of what infrastructures, physical or legal, are in place or should be in place as China goes west. And we'll start with infrastructures over land, which include, of course, highways, railroads, pipelines, and dry ports that connect East Asia to West Asia and onto Europe and beyond. Then we will shift the focus to the maritime world, where acquisition of a strategic port can go a long way. And China has already had big investments in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Oman as well. And these are strategic outposts to that brings China deep into the Arabian Sea, opening up to the Gulf and Horn of Africa as well. And of course, the challenge in all of this, in all these projects that are in place and that are planned, is to find a common legal frame to solve disputes and conflicts that will inevitably arise or have risen already, that involves multiple countries. And in the absence of a shared legal frame, arbitration becomes a key asset. And that's where small city-states like Qatar, Dubai, Singapore have a lot to contribute to, potentially. And that is where we will end the panel with a talk on the role of Singapore in all of this, in this new chapter of Chinese-led globalization. So our first speaker is Professor Bai Gao from Duke University. And the title of his talk is Land Bridge or Bypass, the Middle East and the OBOR.
I would like to use this opportunity to thank Professor He to invite me for this important conference. The topic of my presentation is Land Bridge or Bypass, the Middle East and the One Belt, One Road. So basically, we are at the historical conjuncture where three mega trends began to interact with each other. And China is in the center of all three, but the impact of each trend on each individual country in Middle East varies, significantly. But in order to understand, the so-called China-Middle East relationship, we need to understand, the historical context. So the first one was the so-called pendulum movement of globalization. So in the past several years, we can identify a major, paradigm shift of public policies, especially in industrialized countries, from releasing market forces to protecting society. So if you try to understand, the British exit of EU or the election of President Trump in America, pretty much you need to put that against this larger, context. The second one actually is a technological revolution. In addition to the AI, Internet of Things, big data, cloud computing, particularly directly related to the China-Middle East relationship would be the renewable energy and electronic vehicles. So the third one is a shifting balance of power in the international order, especially characterized by the rise of China and the isolation tendency in the US and the ongoing trade war and its consequences. So the US delegation will be in Beijing actually to make the last round effort to see, we will wait to see whether they can get the deal. But in case they get a deal, energy trade will be a major one. So as you can imagine, then the Chinese import has to, diversify its different sources. Part of the shares, may come from the Middle East because China has promised the US to import a lot of gas, from America. Okay, so look at this picture. This is the top producing countries for crude oil and natural gas for 2017. The U.S. is number one for both of them. So in that sense, when Yin Sheng invited me 5 years ago to Saudi Arabia, I made the same point, namely for Saudi Arabia to understand the changing landscape of its economic resources, you must take note about the fact that the U.S. is going to become the top producer of energy. Second one actually is a rapid development of renewable energy, and especially in China. Due to the time limit, I don't have a lot of the show, but it's significant. The third one is about the electronic vehicles, especially in China. As you may be aware, Tesla is going to start production next year with the potential production capacity of 500,000 units each year. And also, they are talking about the possibility that by 2035, China will stop the production of traditional automobile altogether. So if that happens, the landscape, especially the economic ties between China and the Middle East countries, not only that, but probably the economic ties between Middle East and many other countries will change, simply due to this rapid development. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the two infrastructure programs in China. One is the official program promoted by all kinds of local government, the China-Europe freight trains. The second one actually is led by Alibaba Group. It's an initiative of electronic world trade platform. It's a combination between e-commerce and logistics. Let's talk about the China-Europe freight train first. So this is pretty much the latest statistics. Namely, by the end of 2018, they have run 12,000 trains already, and there were pretty much between 56 Chinese cities and 49 European cities in 15 different countries. They have this kind of operations. So in 2018 alone, the train number were up to 6,300. It's a 72% of annual growth in that 1 year. Okay. So among the 6,300, 2690 actually were the so-called inbounding trains, namely the train from Europe to China. The growth rate for that one is even faster. I think this has potential significance, which is it could be very large. So if you look at in terms of number, this is pretty much the development so far. Okay. Now, my colleague and me published a book called the China-Europe freight train, state building and market building. That's published in 2017. We studied 5 cities. Actually, 4 of them actually were top 5, last year. The only exception is Yiwu, but Yiwu is unique in the sense that, especially related to the Middle East, especially Dubai. Yiwu has a very strong tie with Dubai. Also, Yiwu's operation of the platform company is by a private company. All the rest actually pretty much are state-owned enterprises. But each city has developed their own very unique, characteristics. Now, I think for those, when you talk about one belt, one road, you may think that belt and road are the same. The only difference is the transportation. Actually, I can tell you that's not true. For the belt part, you can see a built-in mechanism that really promote economic development. Here is how it works. The local governments in China support the operation of China-Europe freight train by providing highway subsidies. Why do they do that? Well, one interpretation is, government official want to get promoted. That's one interpretation. But there are serious economic implications. They all compete for the status of national center city. To qualify, you have to be the transportation hub. You have to be the center for international trade. You have to be the center for international cultural exchange. So if you become the so-called natural center city, central government have all kind of policy benefit you can get. So the evaluation system adopted by Chinese local government is really different from the accounting perspective, which just pay attention to the heavy subsidies local government pay. However, the economic side is indeed important. Because of the heavy subsidies, many analysts believe that the China-Europe trend cannot be sustained for long term. Therefore, for local government, whether you could get enough inbound goods, namely the imports from European countries, become crucial. Okay, so if you can get enough imports, the fee they charged for the returning part, can replace part of the subsidies. That's pretty much the economic rationale. So as a result, in order to do that, actually, local governments in China were highly motivated to import. So if you try to understand, the role played by China in the so-called globalization 2.0, this mechanism is politically important. You need to understand. So when you do that, actually that triggered a very dynamic process. It started with the transportation. Then all cities have to build a company in charge of a logistic platform. So I interviewed, that CEO for EU Tianmeng company, and he told me that actually this is how I got from his argument. Namely, initially he started as a logistic company, waiting for the customer. They want to deliver the goods either from China to Europe or from Europe to China. Then he found out that there are so many good trading opportunities. They can do them by themselves. They don't have to wait for other company, asking them to deliver the goods. So he started his company, pretty much started the import business. Now, in the EU, commodity market, actually, their company has a special room full of imports, from Europe. Now, due to the Russian sanction against the European countries, as retaliation against the European sanction against Russia after the Ukraine crisis, all the agricultural goods cannot be shifted by train. That's pretty much Russian, sanction against the European countries. But after that is removed, you can imagine, the import track will be very dramatic. So later, when this guy started, the trading practice, he further found out actually there were many investment opportunities as well. Instead of buying things from European company, actually you can establish the branch office of Chinese company, and you can also establish factories making goods in Europe, then try to import from them. So that really is different from the ocean part of the transportation. Okay. Oh, this is a number. Last year, as you can see, this is the top 5 cities. I was surprised to see Xi'an actually became number 3 in a matter of 2 years. So as you can see, among the 5, 3 of them had more inbound trains than outbound trains. So you can imagine in their accounting book, the local subsidies were reduced substantially because in 3 cities, they have more trains coming from Europe to China. So that replaced a big part of the subsidies provided by local government. Okay, the second one actually is by the Alibaba Group. According to Jack Ma's vision, the current version of globalization has been sustained by internet, cargoes through ocean shipping, and low oil price. And actually, the major players are multinational corporations. As you may know, Alibaba's original vision actually is to help medium-sized and small companies. So in his vision, actually, the globalization 2.0 will be sustained by, electronic world trade platform and the China-Europe freight train. And actually, individual consumers, as you can imagine, in the e-trade, individual consumption is a major component. That will be sustained by, many small and medium-sized enterprises, all over the world. So what is this electronic world trade platform? Actually, it's initiated by the private sector. However, it has to work with the government closely. So the private sectors are going to provide the so-called e-hubs, the platforms. However, government have to help in terms of, reduce tariffs or even make the trade free or speed up, the customs clearance process and provide access to better, finance and logistics. So at this moment, Malaysia and Belgium and Rwanda have officially established, the EWTP, and with Spain is in the negotiation process. So I think at this moment, if you look at the ocean trading part, Dubai probably plays a similar role as these, electronic world trade platforms. Okay, and in order to do that, actually Alibaba Group has, 3 big unicorns. The holding group is pretty much the e-commerce part, but it also has Ant Financial, and it provides, the financing. And Cainiao Logistic Networks is a major logistic platform. So actually, as you can see, the market value of all 3 are significant, comparatively speaking. Why? Why, Alibaba's model has become quite attractive? Simply because Alibaba relies upon the huge Chinese consumption and the domestic market. So this is how much the Chinese GDP grew in 1 year. In 2017, it added, 1.24 trillion US dollars, which is equivalent to Russia and Australia total GDP, roughly, in 1 year. In that 1 year, China added more than half of India and France, 47% of Britain, and more than 1/3 of Germany, 1/4 of Japan. So it is this gigantic consumption and the domestic market in China that has made global leaders actually chasing Jack Ma. Everybody want to meet him. So just look at the picture, 2 of them are from Southeast Asia. And this one was, Indonesia president, and this one is a Malaysia president, a prime minister. So basically, the Alibaba model actually will be the very important infrastructure, okay? As a result of the developing this kind of infrastructure, the trade between China and the countries along the Belt and Road grow very fast in 2018. So pretty much, as you can see, it's a 16.3% growth. and 3.7 higher, 3.7% higher than the trade growth, between China and all other countries. So also, another interesting point is that if you look at export and import, the growth of Chinese import actually was more than twice, as faster as the export. So that's why I identify, the built-in mechanism. If you pretty much use, the China-Europe free trade, because all the local government in China try to import, in order to reduce their financial burden. That's how it happened. Investment from China, this is pretty much a record in 2018. And $15.6 billion, about 9% of increase. Totally, it's only 13% of share of total investment, from China to all countries. And as you can see, the project by Chinese company in these countries increased only 4.4%. But it's pretty much more than half of the total project now, being done by Chinese company in foreign countries. Okay. Now, if you look at the map, this is pretty much, the China-Europe train, networks. As you can see, when we talk about the relationship between China and the Middle East, as long as the railroad network is concerned, actually, it's pretty much, at this moment, it's a bypass. It's not a land bridge. The ocean part, as you can see, back in 1916, the total trade between China and GCC state reached, 117 billion, but more than half of them was with UAE, simply because of Dubai. So as you can see, the city functioned as a major distribution center actually for the ocean transportation part is quite important. Now, as far as the railroad part is concerned, actually, it's a water and land combination because the railroad network among Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey has already started operation. Now, between Chengdu and Turkey's, I think, Kars, there are already regular operation. Also, many countries have proposed the water-land combination between, Europe and China crossing two, Black Sea and the Caspian Seas. So if you look at the day, how many days, it takes 33 days, from China to Egypt, 27 days to, Dubai. But it takes only about 15 days at most to reach Middle East countries. Now, this is the original slide I used 5 years ago in Saudi Arabia. And a potential, land bridge version is about, after China, actually now this part has already in operation. And basically through land pass, actually China's freight train already reached Iran. However, I asked the CEO of the company that did that in 1 week after Xi Jinping, visited Iran back in 1916, he said that the Iran government charged too much. So his company cannot afford, to maintaining the regular, operations. So, but now for this, another part is about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. But according to the bilateral long-term strategic planning, the railroad network will eventually finish by 2030. So we still have more than 10 years to that. Okay, let me briefly make the final. Okay, here's a major argument similar to the minister point. Basically, in order for Middle East country to take advantage, from China's Belt and Road Initiative, local things are more important. I think most leaders in Middle Eastern country still are in the so-called Cold War mentality. Geopolitical thinking. You have to convert yourself to geoeconomic thinking in order to make it work. look at what India and Japan have done, with China in the past 12 months. Even though they all have political tensions, then they all manage to cool down, to make the economic side work. I think the minister also mentioned the wisdom about ASEAN. That's what I believe Middle East countries really should learn from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bai Gao, for the very insightful, broad overview of the overland routes that China will be using in the coming decades. And now we're moving to the maritime world with Dr. Jatin from University of Michigan and Harvard. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Professor Ng-Seng Ho for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. Yes, so as Serkan was saying, today we will move from land to sea as soon as my PowerPoint is. And part of what I want to do today is also think about the geography of the Middle East, and I'll be talking about one of the farthest points, namely Djibouti, as a way to think about what this maritime choke point in the Bab el-Mandeb can tell us about questions regarding maritime expansion and oceanic trade. So So to begin with, maritime trade remains central to global commerce. I mean, this slide below is an image of currently all the ships that are at sea. In a place like Singapore, this is a very sort of visible part and presence of the city's geography. But some 90% of trade, a global trade, approximately 6 billion tons of cargo travels on 100,000 cargo ships that are operated by over 1 million seafarers. And one of the things that I want to highlight today is also that part of the infrastructural question in maritime infrastructures is the question also of labor and shipping, and the various ways in which labor contracts and things like wind and sea currents also shape the possibilities and impossibilities of trade. So the Indian Ocean is central to this global sea of trade. 8 out of 10 of the busiest deep sea ports have most of their major trade volumes go through the Indian Ocean, and within that, some 22,000 to 25,000 vessels transit through the Suez Canal, which was recently expanded. Every day, 3.3 million barrels of oil move through the Bab el-Mandeb, representing some 30% of the world's oil supply. Am I pointing the wrong? Okay, so yeah. So this, as you can see here, we have the new Suez Canal, the expansion, the movement from going to a single lane of traffic to 2 lanes of traffic, which so far has not really led to an increase in the number of actual containers, but has reduced shipping time. So which ties to what Professor Bai Gao was talking about in the shipping, the transit times. And one of the major slowdowns of transit is, of course, places like the Suez. So within this, part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative has been creating a blue economy, what I'm calling a blue economy. The Maritime Silk Road initiative seeks to develop blue economic passages connecting Beijing to global economic hubs. In fact, the Chinese State Oceanic Administration recently called the 21st century the century of oceans. There's still this emphasis that oceanic trade is what will connect China to the world. In fact, if we look at China's marine GDP, which is the marine industry's exploitation of oceanic resources, as well as port services, including tourism, this is about 10% of its total GDP. If it was a country, the maritime economy of China would rank 15th in the world. So we are talking about a very large percentage of it is tied to the circulation of ships at sea. Port making is a significant aspect of this. Most of this port financing has happened through loans that are financed by state-backed enterprises. And you can see the geography of this port making that extends all across West Africa, East Africa. So part of what I want to also argue here is thinking about the Middle East as part of a larger system. Right? What is happening here is also important to think about in relationship to questions that are happening as China expands in West Africa. And so part of the question becomes, how do we understand this process of port making? What is the relationship between geoeconomics and geopolitics? In some ways, if recent history is an indicator, we're entering, China's entry into this world through port making is a move towards going beyond profit in some ways. If you look at the naval port visits from 2003 to 2018, these are official, documented when Chinese vessels have visited ports. The highest number is Oman, followed by Djibouti, Pakistan, Yemen, and Thailand, and so on. So China is entering into an already crowded neighborhood where we have, and this was talked about earlier in the previous panel, that there are prior forms of geopolitical competition and cooperation, and this is linked, especially in the Indian Ocean, to a longer history where trade and raid, or geoeconomics and geopolitics, are not distinct, but rather part of a similar process. Right, so we had many ways of organizing this. So if we can go back to the Portuguese entrance into the Indian Ocean in the 15th century through essentially a state-backed enterprise and also private trade. Similarly, the British and the Dutch internalized those protection costs through private companies. So part of a question becomes how to see this as a longer history, and in that sense, how do we locate what is happening in places like Djibouti or in Oman, which is where I've been doing most of my research, within longer kind of rise and fall of various imperial projects. So, the remote seems to be stuck. There we go. All right, so, and in the Indian Ocean, one of the largest questions become that most of the sites for maritime risk are very much linked to places that China is doing a lot of investment in, both in the Bab el-Mandeb in Horn of Africa, but also in West Africa, where the majority of port making is happening. Chinese port making is also one of the major sites of maritime risk. So this is a high risk, high reward, but fundamentally a high risk game that is being played here. And as I said before, this is part of a great power competition in the sense that China enters not into a blank slate, but rather into a crowded neighborhood. And we continue to have, even in spite of the rhetoric of isolation in US and Europe, we continue to have a large presence, particularly in the Indian Ocean, of US naval bases, the UK, and when I talk about Djibouti, we'll see that Italians and almost everyone has wants a seat at the table. What I want to focus on today is the centrality, if oceanic trade is central to the expansion of the Maritime Silk Road. Within oceanic trade, the Bab el-Mandeb remains deeply central to, as a potential choke point for China's expansion, particularly to Europe and the Middle East. So in that sense, if the Middle East is in the middle of something, the Bab el-Mandeb is the door that it opens up beyond that. So what happens at the Bab allows us to see these larger conflicts at play, but also this provides a natural choke point, a natural form of interruption that China has to navigate. And I want to, before going to Djibouti, I want to start with, I was in Oman doing research when a lot of things started happening around port making, and much attention has been paid when it comes to Chinese port expansion to questions of debt leveraging, right? So one of the key examples has been the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where in 2000, which China Harbor Engineering, one of Beijing's state-owned enterprise, took over the port, as well as 15,000 acres around it on a 99-year lease after loans were due to loan repayment. And there's similar concerns about other port projects and these white elephant issues. So as I was looking at this, yet it seems like there's not a consistency in the way in which these port plans are playing out. In some cases, like in Hambantota, you have questions around debt, But in other places where I've been doing a lot of research in Duqm in Oman, there's a very different story. And as I was sitting in Oman, watching some of the things that were unfolding in Haifa, so this thinking about the larger questions that are at stake here, and why is it that in some places we have, port making leads to conflicts and in other places not. So just let's look quickly at these two places. The port of Duqm, which is about 500 kilometers south of Muscat, and Haifa in Israel. And if you remember the map that I had pulled up, Oman's strategic location has led to it being the most visited port by the Chinese Navy. And it's on the strategic axis between the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Peninsula. It acts as a regional hub, and in some ways a competition to what Dubai does. It's closer, actually, to the Suez than geographically Dubai would be. And Oman's history with China goes back to 1970s, when the Sultanate of Oman and the People's Republic established diplomatic relationships. In fact, in 2016, China had become the top foreign investor in the Middle East, and in particular in Oman. So part of this was, Oman is the largest debtor to China in this region. So it has borrowed over 3.6 billion from Chinese financial institutions, and a significant portion of this has been towards developing Duqm, which is this port about 500 kilometers south of Muscat. And this is a hybrid mix of Oman Vanfang, which is a consortium of 6 private firms with local Omanis partners. And there's an attempt to build both an industrial city as well as, so special economic zones, as well as ports. And this has been relatively conflict-free, in contrast to when the Shanghai International Port Group in Haifa has a major stake in the port and agreed to take over management from 2021. So you had the Americans, particularly John Bolton, coming in, and essentially, the U.S. Navy threatening not to dock in Haifa. And there's been pressures increasingly to change investment law. Part of the reason why the Haifa port deal went through with Shanghai International was that investment in civilian infrastructure until recently in Israel was not subject to any kind of, within the regulatory structure, private cities could make those arrangements. There was not a need to go to look at the potential defense questions around it. At least that's, so part of it has to do with a recent relative independence of Oman in recent geopolitical wranglings, right? So it's tucked between Saudi Arabia and Iran, was very close to the US, especially under the Obama era, but recently under Trump, partly in response to the accusations that Oman is funding Houthi rebels in Yemen. There was a sort of vacuum that China was able to fill in from 2016 onwards. Whereas in Haifa, China enters a specifically US-centric domain. So there's a question of what happens, when trade becomes also part of expanding geopolitics. How do we understand, so that how other actors respond to China? And quickly, because I'm running out of time, I want to so there are certain places where other states come and go, but then there's the port of Djibouti, where everyone almost has to be there. So part of Djibouti is in some ways should be seen as a limit case. If you see where it is, it's strategically essential for keeping the gates of the Bab al-Mandab open, right? And it has, if you look at the list of, so how I want to understand Djibouti is that it's a navigational choke point. It's a site that constricts the flow of movement, of people, of goods. And while it's locatable on a map, in fact, it has downstream and upstream effects that extend far beyond it. So in some ways, Djibouti is not just a local story, one that maybe even isn't part of the Middle East as we conceptualize it within a certain area studies paradigm, but part of a broader story that has impact certainly with the GCC, certainly with the US. And if you look at the list of, so the sort of shift in Djibouti as it goes from a French colony into a strategic outpost, partly both because of what's happening in its hinterland with the Eritrean-Ethiopian war and the lack of a port for Ethiopia, as well as a shift in the US military strategy, first with the global war on terror, but increasingly with piracy that brought everyone in Djibouti. So you have, if you look at the list of naval bases, you have the Chinese naval base, which is the most recent, you have the Les Forces Françaises, the French naval base, the Italian military base, which expanded. This is the first time since World War II, essentially, that the Italians have left Italy. The Japanese are building a big, beyond counter-piracy. The US has Camp Lemonnier, which is its forward operating base with over 4,000 soldiers plus drone facilities. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the non-lease presence of Germany, Netherlands, Iran, Qatar, India, and the United Kingdom. So you can see, and also the proximity of this. So I do research in Djibouti city, and you can go from essentially on one highway from where the PLA's naval base is to the French naval base to the US, and this creates this fascinating tension of places having to, there are conflicts at sea, conflicts elsewhere, but in Djibouti they all have to share the same ground, and the kind of questions that emerge from that of how so if you go back to it, Djibouti is the second naval port. This is the Camp Lemonnier, and initially, and very quickly out through this. So part of what we're seeing now is a move from cooperation, which happened during the heydays of piracy, to okay, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at the port of Dorale, which is, okay, so I'll just stop. So a move from cooperation to now increasingly conflict. So in the first 5 years of this port expansion, pirates provided a way for everyone to coordinate their efforts. As you travel through the Bab el-Mandeb, you enter into various jurisdictions, but increasingly what we are starting to see are various conflicts. The biggest conflict is one that is built around the port of Dorale, which in 2000 was DP World, which is one of the largest port companies, had announced a 30-year partnership, which in 2014, Djibouti ended unilaterally. And part of the reason it has come out as it's gone into arbitration that it ended it unilaterally was the emergence of China Merchants Holding, a Hong Kong-based company that the government of Djibouti had a contract with to take over the port. And what has happened in recent years, there's been an MOU signed by China Merchants and Djibouti that has led to a number of high-profile, DP World has contested this, and it has led to a number of high-profile cases. In 2018, Djibouti lost its arbitration case against DP World, and in this year, actually 2 weeks ago, the DP World also sued the China Merchants Holding in Hong Kong, which is now a major stakeholder in the port of Dorale and Djibouti port building. So part of what we see is a beginning of the ways these conflicts, and I guess our next speaker will talk about how these, what happens in these close proximities is not only cooperation, but increasingly conflict. How one manages this conflict is going to be a bellwether for how far the expansion of these maritime lanes and China's project will be. And I quickly want to end with one example, if I can. I may not. Okay, let's skip this. I'm just going to talk about, and also one of the things that happens in Djibouti is the fact that most of this trade was dealt with through local Hadrami and other networks. And part of what was happening when China comes in is that it's both displacing previous forms of intermediaries and brokerage that were built on older logics. And so how China responds to that will be important. But I'll quickly end with this. This is when I was in Djibouti in the summer of 2018, the biggest thing in the news was laser fights between the Chinese and US planes. The US launched created an official complaint arguing that the Chinese naval, that there were Chinese military personnel from the naval base were pointing laser pens, I guess akin to this, on U.S. planes that were landing at Camp Lemonnier next door. And this became a major diplomatic showdown that led to, at one point, the U.S. refusing to dock in the port of Djibouti. And I think, again, it's these small little moments through which we can hopefully see a larger geopolitical dimension that's at play in the choke point. And my time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jatin. These two papers, it's becoming very obvious that there are actually big differences between the belt and the road. And I think that's something we will address in the Q&A. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Hwang, Chief Judge, Dubai International Financial Center. I welcome you. The title of his talk is The Creation of a Dispute Resolution Regime for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Good morning. While my slides are coming up, let me just correct one point about my CV in view of the furore in Malaysia about fake credentials. My term as Chief Justice of the DIFC courts came to an end in November, so I'm now former Chief Justice. Right. The question that I'm going to ask today, for your benefit, is what, if any, is China's master plan for resolving the inevitable commercial disputes that will arise in BRI projects? The short answer is, for now, there is no grand design apparent. So let's explore what options are currently open for BRI disputes. And that's point 4 on this slide. You can have an international commercial court, which is of course neutral. Secondly, you could go the traditional route of international arbitration. Third is a remedy that has always been there, but has not really been properly appreciated in terms of its efficacy. And that is simply working with the existing system in domestic courts. If you have a dispute, go to your domestic court, get a judgment from the domestic court, and then see how far your domestic court judgment travels. And finally, and this is a coming, I think, method of dispute resolution, mediation. But let's look at the first and most exciting or interesting, perhaps not so much exciting, but interesting development on the Chinese side. And that is, in 2018, they established the Chinese International Commercial Court. And essentially, the CICC is not a separate independent court of its own. It's really a division of the existing Supreme People's Court, which is the highest court in the Chinese legal hierarchy. Although the CICC is supposed to be situated in two places, at least, Xi'an and Shenzhen, in reality, it's at the moment being run out of Beijing, because all of the judges who have been appointed to sit in the CICC are existing Supreme People's Court judges. However, they have been chosen with regard to one of the terms of reference of the CICC, which is that the judges should be capable of understanding and conducting legal proceedings in both English and Chinese. I have had the privilege of meeting several of the SPC judges who are also judges on the CICC. Interestingly, the ladies seem to be much more fluent in English than the men, and usually because the men are the older ones, right? So it's the younger generation who've had the opportunity to hone up the English and go overseas and so on. But they have some very talented judges and very young as well. Now, I'm going to go through this very quickly. The significance of the jurisdiction is to understand how important this court will be in practice. Now, the first requirement for the CICC to take jurisdiction is parties must voluntarily choose the Supreme People's Court, or I suppose they can choose the CICC specifically. But the minimum amount of the claim must be $45 million US, 300 million renminbi, which is roughly US 45 million. So it's not a people's court in that way. Second, you can have a referral up from the highest people's court, which is below the Supreme People's Court, and they think that it's a fit case for the SPC. SPC accepts the referral. The third way that the CICC will hear a case is that somebody can argue that this is a significant commercial case and it will have a nationwide significant impact. What that means, we'll have to see. Fourth is rather technical, although from the lawyer's point of view, it's quite interesting. You will go to the CICC for setting aside an enforcement of arbitration awards, and also for what we call preservative measures, which are emergency measures in arbitration. So it is really a parallel court meant to assist international arbitration, which is quite good news because it will assist in the development of international arbitration in China. And finally, there's a sweep-up clause that allows the SPC itself to simply assign any case it thinks to be fit to be tried by the CICC. There are two basic difficulties with the current structure of the CICC if you want to look at it purely from the viewpoint of, is this a truly international commercial court? First, the choice has been made not to establish an independent court with its own independent charter. It is part of the Supreme People's Court. All the judges are considered to be national Chinese judges, and the CICC is a national Chinese court. Therefore, following Chinese law, the language of all court proceedings must be Chinese. All the judges must be Chinese nationals. So you cannot look at this as a true international court. Now, they have tried to alleviate these difficulties by a couple of measures. Two of the more interesting ones are, they're going to allow, apparently, exhibits and papers and submissions to be tendered in English, because the judges are supposed to be bilingual. But the language actually used in court will have to be Chinese. Then secondly, they've created an advisory panel of 20 to 30 quite distinguished international legal experts who will deal with questions of foreign law. So what we do not know yet is whether when the advisory panel's services are called on and the SPC passes a case to the international advisory panel to deal with, whether in fact and in reality the international advisory panel will actually decide the dispute and then send a recommended solution back to the SPC, who will not retry it and simply adopt the recommendation. But that's something that has yet to be played out. But however you tweak the CICC, it has limitations. It has no automatic jurisdiction over non-Chinese parties involved in BRI projects outside of China. So it's a national court, it does not have long-arm jurisdiction outside of China. So if you want to resolve a BRI dispute, then the other party than the Chinese party will have to sign up to go to the CICC. At this moment, in this early stage, it's difficult to see how many parties in BRI countries would be willing to submit to what you might call hometown justice by referring their disputes to the CICC. Unless, of course, the Chinese party, who is the contracting party, exercises its commercial bargaining power and insists on having dispute resolution decided by the CICC in China. What are the alternatives to the CICC at the moment? The first one would be the London Commercial Court. Now, that is the most famous commercial court in the world, so that is not a lot of dispute about that. In terms of whether or not they could do BRI disputes, theoretically they could. Theoretically, they can hear cases from anywhere around the world if both parties submit. But the two practical considerations are, London is rather far from East Asia. It is not that far from Eurasia, the Eurasian countries. It's not that far from the Gulf, the Middle East. It's like 7 hours, that kind of distance. But also, the London legal justice system is pretty expensive, even by international standards. Second is Hong Kong, which is a mini London, if you like. It has an excellent reputation. Its courts have an excellent reputation, particularly in East Asia, and has long experience of trying cases involving Chinese parties. Now, those two are just traditional national courts with international jurisdiction. But then you come to two courts which were specifically created with international disputes in mind. The first is our own Singapore International Commercial Court. I don't need to tell this audience too much about it. And that was established 4 or 5 years ago and doing quite well at the moment with a relatively heavy caseload. They're always in the papers every few months with some very interesting case. So it is building up for itself an international reputation. The fourth is the DIFC courts, which I had the honor to head for some years. And that is a unique court because it is a common law court, English language speaking, but set in a civil law country. So it has experience both of common law as well as the civil law elements, which are very often weaved into our cases. Number 5 is a list of other possible international courts. They were, again, created with the intention of becoming international courts. The Qatar International Court, the Abu Dhabi Global Marketplace Courts, and the most recent, the Astana International Financial Center Court, which is in Kazakhstan. Now, of these three, they are basically established along the same lines as the DIFC courts were. So I don't need to explain them too much, except to say that they are not, at the moment, much on the radar screen. Now let me turn to the most popular traditional form of international commercial dispute resolution, and that is international arbitration. The reason why it's so popular is because of the very global enforceability of any international arbitration award. Up to date, it's the number of countries which have signed up to the New York Convention, which provides for enforcement of any international arbitration award, is 159 and still growing. And the vast majority of countries in the BRI region have ratified this convention, and the exceptions are listed there, and you can take a view of your own as to how much the international commercial world is missing without these guys having signed the NYC. Therefore, prima facie, you start with the assumption that for purposes of enforceability, international arbitration is the most desirable. And accompanying the New York Convention is the UNCITRAL, meaning the United Nations Model Law of Arbitration. And the statistics are that at the moment, 80 nation states and 111 jurisdictions, such as Hong Kong, have adopted the model law. And of the BRI countries, 43 out of the 70 plus BRI countries have also adopted the model law. So it is a common code, and therefore it encourages people to use international arbitration, because you can do an arbitration in one or other of the BRI countries and find that you're working with the same procedures. But there are still challenges and limitations. And that is that China itself is a little bit of an outlier in the world of international arbitration. It is not a model law country. It still has significant differences in its arbitration law, which I won't go into now, from the rest of the world, but it's obviously a hugely important arbitration jurisdiction. So at the moment, that is not necessarily the preferred route. Now, this is the more interesting route. I told you about simply using the existing domestic court procedures in all of the BRI countries and say, let's get a judgment. And after that, let's see how far your judgment will travel. And it is really an unappreciated fact or underappreciated fact that even if you do not go to arbitration and you just sue in your own domestic court, it's surprising how far a domestic court judgment can travel. Now, I put this to the test. I was in China last year, in Xi'an, in fact, when they launched the CICC there. And in a forum, I asked the question, in this audience, how many of you know how many countries will recognize Chinese judgments? Nobody actually knew. Then somebody, I think, who had some access to official information said, I think 30 plus. So what I said to him is this, your 30 plus means you are thinking only about countries with whom China has got mutual recognition treaties. And he said, yes. I said, look beyond that, because out there in the big world beyond, common law countries have a doctrine based in inherent in their law, that common law countries will recognize judgments coming from any other country, common law or civil law. I won't say no questions asked, but the conditions for recognition are very straightforward and not difficult. Whereas within civil law countries, they do not have this universal recognition of other countries' judgments, which is why the Chinese person who answered me was thinking about treaties. Because most civil law countries require another condition which do not exist in common law, and that is the requirement of reciprocity. You recognize my judgment, I'll recognize your judgment. So the only way you can be assured of it is having a treaty. But there are other ways of proving it, but it's a bit complicated. Okay. But things are changing. What has happened then is China has signed up to the 2005 Hague Convention on Choice of Court Agreements. The short effect of this is that all countries which sign this convention agree to enforce a judgment from another country that has signed the convention if the arbitration is held, if the judgment is heard by a court which has jurisdiction by choice of the parties. Now, there are a lot of individual countries who have signed up the Hague Convention. At the latest count is 34 members. Now that in itself is not very big, but that 34 members includes the whole of the EU. So EU has 28 countries. You take away UK, Brexit or no Brexit, you take away Ireland, and because these two you get for free, they are common law countries. So you're left with 26 new countries, mostly the important economic countries in Western Europe, which will recognize Chinese judgments. So it's moving along, and if you add up the 30 treaties that China has signed, assuming there's no duplication, then you are getting close to 100 judgments. So this is an unappreciated method of recognition. And finally, a very quick word about mediation. Now, this is, as it were, the rising sun. First of all, why mediation is likely to play a more important role in the development of BRI dispute resolution is, first, mediation resonates with Chinese culture, and I think in a number of other BRI countries as well. Secondly, we have a new impetus from the UN again, a new convention called the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Again, what that does is to make settlement agreements equivalent to arbitration awards or judgments, which can be sued on directly in a convention country. That convention will be signed in Singapore on the 7th of August this year. And again, hopefully that's a dawn of a new era. Specific to the BRI, in January of this year, the Singapore International Mediation Center signed an MOU with CCPIT and CCOIC. These are two Chinese state agencies which are in charge of international trade and mediation. And they are jointly going to put up a mediation center to deal with BRI institutes. So if I answer my question again is there a grand plan? We don't know. But the short answer is I don't think we're missing it that much at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Hwang. Now the floor is open for your questions. Please raise your hand and then quickly introduce yourselves. And please keep the questions very short. Yes, first.
Hello, my name is Pema Dalsideri. I'm from the King Faisal Center. Okay, that's fine. Great. I have a question to Dr. Duan. Actually, I really enjoyed your talk. What I just say? Does this work? Okay, that's fine. Much better. Okay. I have a question for you. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think generally your focus, given the time limits, was mostly looking at sort of China's engagement with this port building activity and sort of different case studies and the problems and challenges it was facing. But I'm also wondering about how does China's port-making activity conflict with other regional actors that also have their own strategic political ambitions? And I'm thinking specifically in terms of the Gulf region, where, I mean, we can talk about Gwadir, for example, and the Saudi role there, but I'm thinking specifically with the Horn of Africa, where we've seen Saudi appoint an African Affairs minister, we've seen the word Red Sea security become very important, there's mediation efforts, Eritrea, Ethiopia, but also one big component in all that engagement, both for the Saudis and the Emiratis, is port-making activity. And I'm just wondering whether you could talk a bit more on sort of how this competition on port control, port making, or building is going to impact Sino-Gulf relations. I mean, I heard this, I mean, I think it's actually more of a rumor, but it's interesting allusion to this dynamic where the Hadi government in Yemen was actually considering bringing in Chinese control of the Aden port as a means to sort of limit Emirati involvement there on the ground. I mean, I think this is probably an unsubstantiated rumor, but it's an indicator of that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's happening, especially which makes a place like Djibouti a really interesting case study, is precisely because not only is, sort of part of what I want to show is that Chinese presence is always already within other kinds of historical, more recent histories, longer histories of geopolitical competition, whether they're at between the Saudis and the Emiratis, or in the case of Djibouti, also between sort of Hadrami Emirati businessmen and who have connections to Yemen and Ethiopia versus Qatar, nation state. So in that sense, one of the ways that I've understood what's happening in Djibouti is part of a longer strategy where you brought in an outsider to negotiate often very local kinds of disputes. So in the case of Djibouti, bringing in the Chinese was a way for the Djibouti government to actually try and leverage both against the EU and because the EU it wanted to renegotiate the concessions that it had with the EU, as well as with the Saudi government that wants to now establish a base there. So there's a way that and this is one of the interesting things about places like Djibouti and choke points is it's unclear
what makes them interesting is that it isn't often that the most powerful one wins out, in the sense like that there's something about that dynamic that one can play off these powers against each other, and sometimes successfully in ways that other choke points in other places, Singapore, for example, have done, and sometimes and we'll see what happens with Japan. So.
Let's do a quick round of questions, and we'll end. Before the original time. Yes, first, second.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the excellent speeches. My question is for Dr. Hwang, Talan Sultan from Kyrgyzstan. I think the topic you bring up is especially acute for our country. At the moment, we have 2 ministers, 2 mayors of the capital city, and 2 prime ministers in jail for over a year, waiting trial on charges related to BRI project. And it's a domestic political matter, but of course the shadow will be cast on the BRI initiative because it's a Chinese funding, 100% paid to Chinese contractor, but then the charges are that the costs were overrun. So in this situation, I don't know who we should apply to these opportunities. It would be from Kyrgyzstan, or should it be Chinese side saying that you cannot, just say that our projects are over costly. Thank you.
Let's get the other questions very quick as well, and then we'll do it on. Yes. Please keep it short, please.
Hi, my name is Zizin. I'm from Business China Youth Chapter. My question is directed to Dr. Hwang. I realized that the Ministry of Law has been promoting promoting Chinese companies to choose Singapore under the governance clause in terms of like when they sign contracts, what is the area of jurisdiction. So I'm wondering, what is it that makes Singapore law like chosen? I'm not a legal expert, but like how do we make Singapore law more attractive for people to choose it instead of, let's say, New York law or English law, which is a more common option? And also, does it matter like what the governing law is? Is it like beneficial to Singapore if Singapore law is chosen? Thank you.
Thank you. And gentleman over here.
Thank you. Just a word of caution with a question mark at the end. I'm not aware of any significant problem concerning the part of the Haifa port which was given to a Chinese company. I am aware of the fact that there are numerous American think tanks, and all those people employed there have to write something, and some of them have chosen to write about this big problem, presumably, of the Sixth Fleet, the American Sixth Fleet, coming to Haifa. And there is nothing in the Haifa port that you cannot watch very carefully, sitting in your convenient, on your balcony in one of the nice hotels on the top of Mount Carmel. Nothing is going to escape you. So I was just wondering, what was the basis to you including Dokkum, which is a different opera, with Haifa? Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, let's start.
Just because there was only one question. So I'm interested in, as I said, with Haifa, it's certainly a matter of caution. Like what I'm interested in is the discourse around these ports, as well as why. So the larger question becomes, why is it that certain port projects get mired in controversies? Whether it's in the case of Sri Lanka, we see the consequences of it in places like, and part of it. So I'll admit that this is, as I was in Dokkum, where there isn't this kind of discourse. I was curious why there was a rhetoric around, the U.S. Sixth Fleet may not come there, and part of this is obviously all of this is as much speculation, right? When it comes to port making, there's a story of the speculative futures of what will happen if these kinds of investments continue. So I bring that up not as a way, since this is certainly not my analysis of do not work in Haifa, so it's not a way to say that this is what's happening. But I was very curious why, in the case of Dukum, you didn't have either official or unofficial U.S. U.S. policymakers or think tanks or others going on record and talking about geopolitics there versus in other places you did. So part of what I'm trying to understand is how do these ports become mired in geopolitics and in other moments do not. So that's why. But I appreciate your caution.
Sorry, to the first question about Turkmenistan, I think I may not have understood the question correctly, but let's be clear. The BRI that exists as an initiative is a theme. It has no legal status as such, except to the extent that it's reflected in domestic laws. So BRI does not override national laws unless national laws are changed to accommodate certain principles. Therefore, if we're talking about things going wrong in a particular country, owing to certain BRI projects, then you have to analyze the relationship between the parties in the commercial relationship by the governing law that they have chosen or are deemed to be chosen. If any criminal acts are committed, then obviously that the criminal law of the relevant country will take priority. And if a criminal act of corruption, for example, takes place, it will also affect the commercial relationship because fraud and corruption usually nullifies obligations under the contract. I hope that answers that part of the question. Now, it may lead on to the second question I asked about, has BRI any significance in terms of a broader concept of harmonization or convergence of national laws over a grouping? In Asia, we are starting to talk about it because in Singapore, we established the Asia Business Law Institute a few years back. And one of the tasks of the ABLI is to do research on the various laws, commercial laws in the different countries, certainly the major economic powers within the region, and to try and pick on certain areas where you can harmonize national laws so that you can get code and make, of course, international trade and commerce more relevant. And so now I turn to the question of the second question as to what makes Singapore law attractive, and is there a policy of pushing Singapore law as a choice of law? The answer is yes. MinLaw does have a policy for some time of trying to encourage people engaged in commerce and trade to deliberately choose Singapore law as the governing law of the transaction. And the big selling point, if I may put it this way, and this is the way I would put it if you ask me to sell Singapore law, is Singapore, everybody agrees that one of the great gifts that the British gave us is the common law. But from the Singapore perspective, the Brits polluted their own law to a certain extent when they joined the EU. So that's not what we want in Singapore. We passed a law some years ago saying that we will accept all English law as defined. We're not taking anything else. So we are deliberately excluding all EU laws. And this is what you go to other countries in the region and says, look, you're familiar with English law, and as a governing law to dictate, to judge or to be the yardstick by which our commercial behavior is to take place, it's good. We use English common law. But, do you want to apply all those European standards? And hopefully they say no. And then you say, well, you go back to pure common law, which is Singapore law. Of course, after Brexit, the British will have to go back to their pure common law. But that's another story.
I thank all the participants. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me for a round of applause for this panel.